This conversation that you're about to hear seems to me to be addressing this question. Ready? Does politics show up in our everyday lives? Maybe even in our most intimate relationships?
And while a lot of folks may be saying, no, politics doesn't impact me, I don't do politics, we think the actual answer for most of us in this country is a resounding yes. In fact, we've actually recorded whole episodes and written whole book chapters on this very topic. Yes, politics impacts our daily lives, including being in our marriages, our parent-child relationships, and so much more.
I think that's why I want to just emphasize how grateful we are. I mean, we're really privileged to have this conversation with someone who took the chance to use her voice in a new way, moving from academia, diving really bravely into personal essays in order to help all of us hear about her journey confronting the model minority myth that so many Asian folks in America are impacted by. And she inspired both of us along the way. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic best friends and hosts, Sarah and Misashi.
Okay, super excited for today's conversation for a whole host of reasons. But first, would you mind introducing yourself for our audience?
Yes, my name is Cheng. I am a professor of English literature at Princeton University and the author of several academic books. But this book that we're talking about today is my first non-academic books of personal essays.
I'm so glad that you wrote this book of personal essays because there was so much in it that I kept finding, you know, as an Asian, as a multi-ethnic Asian woman, daughter of a Japanese immigrant, that I felt I saw myself in some of the things that you said. And I'd love to start here. You know, there was at one point, and this is something that has been something very resonant to me this particular year. But at one point in your book, you say, I have been living at least partially someone else's idea of a good life. And that really hit home. And it was against two things, two structures in particular for me, right? One was this traditional model of success that is here in our like American system that pursues money and power and, you know, I'm a product of the Ivy League and all of these markers of traditional success. But then also figuring myself out as an Asian woman who's absorbed stereotypes of how I was like, air quote, supposed to be. Can we talk about what you felt those ideals were that you saw? And quite frankly, like it's a tough battle to figure out where you start and where the structures end. And you did an incredibly beautiful job parsing it out. Can you talk about, again, these ideals and then what it took for you to recognize and stand against them?
Yeah, you know, the book subtitle is How I Stopped Being a Model Minority. And it's not really true. It's more like how I want to keep working on stopping being a model minority, and how I've hit certain walls in my life that made me realize I don't want to be a model minority. But it's a continual battle because, as you say, exactly that, you know, we're so much a product of our upbringing and social and cultural forces. And at some point, it's very hard to tell the difference between what is expected of me and what I expect of myself. And oftentimes what feels like expectation outside becomes that you think it's your own desire. And the funny thing about my life looking back is I think there are many ways in which when I was younger, I thought I was actually bucking against expectations. So for example, everybody in my family are doctors, men and now women too. They're all physicians. And there's one or two like outliers, like there's a theoretical physicist and a mathematician, you know, but like as an English major who was interested in writing poetry, you know, like years ago, as a young person, I really felt like I was just bucking against the trends. But at the same time, one thing that I realized as I get older is that, yeah, there are ways in which I was resisting all that, but there were all these other ways in which I was completely playing into the idea of a model minority, right? Like I work really hard, you know, I was a good student. I'm always trying to be the person that have the solution or keep peace for everyone. So there are many, many ways in which I had imagined, I think this is part of what was hard, was I had imagined I was not part of this model minority myth. And then in my very late 50s, and I realized, oh my God, I was exactly the thing that I had been deconstructing in the classroom with my students. And I think this realization came to me because of a bunch of crises that happened in my life in the last few years. And it has to do with dealing with cancer and the cancer diagnosis at the same time that the pandemic was happening. So I was sick, the world was sick, and then all that anti-Asian violence was happening. And I realized that all the things that I used to rely on for a sense of purpose and for a sense of purpose, I'm just like moving on. All the things I used to do, that I relied on, my intellectual work, my sense of self-worth, my sense of self-mastery, my sense of picking myself, my sense of resilience, all those things were basically failing. They were failing me. And when that happened, I realized, one, that, oh, all those things I used to do were in fact part of this model minority myth. And two, that they did do a lot for me, in the sense that I do have a good job now, and all that. But what I hadn't accounted for were, one, all the psychical costs that these efforts have cost me. And two, how sometimes they're just not enough. They're not enough to face certain kind of crisis in life. And that I needed to rethink my way of surviving in this world.
Thank you for sharing that. That way of surviving, it comes down to we have enough value because we exist, and we are at peace because we are here and we are worthwhile. And I wonder, there's the model minority myth, and I'm sort of talking as I process this, but it sounds like some of the messages we take as Asian folks buying into the model minority myth, but it feels like, this model minority myth and the values of hard work and self-sacrifice and this sort of stuff that goes into it also plays into the notion of what it takes to succeed in capitalism. You have to be almost an inhuman level of hard worker. You have to buy into this system of self-sacrifice. And it is almost like a rebellion to undo that. And as unfortunate as it is to have crisis take you to that stage, I wonder what more of us can do to use our voice now to say, I don't want that. I want to be present. I want to take care of myself because I am just simply a human being and therefore worth it. And how did you find the courage to put your voice to deconstructing this stuff? Because I would have been terrified to put this out in the world. Some of the things that you shared.
It's funny that you asked the question because one of the things that happened to me after chemo, which kind of broke me down completely, and had to sort of rebuild myself up, even as a person, even as a personality, because during chemo, it's hard to describe, but when you're going through chemo, and I'm sure it's different for other different people, but for me, it wasn't so much like chemo was painful. It wasn't painful. It was just this radical erasure of who I was. I was like a blank person. I had no personality. I had no interest. I didn't want to eat. I didn't want to watch movies. I didn't want to read, which scared me. Normally, reading is something that's like a haven for me. And all the things I used to love, I have no interest in at all. I have no capacity to do. And so I felt very broken down. And it's, there's a sort of part of what I had to do was kind of rebuild myself. But two things about the model minority. One is that I used to always think of the model minority as an economic model, make money, be successful. But what I didn't realize was that it's also a kind of social personality model, because it's a bunch of personality traits, right? It's about being, the peacemaker, being the person that everyone likes, being the resilient person, being the diligent person. There were all these sort of they're connected to the economic side, but they're also really a kind of ethos, of how to be a social person. And that's the part that I thought has been really hard for me. But one of the things that I was saying about being broken was that I realized that as a part of that coming back to myself was I realized there was so much in my life that I hadn't said either to my children or to my husband or to myself. And so one of my ways of resisting or rebelling against the minority was part of what I felt was a kind of gag order that I had placed on myself for a very long time. And so one of the things I started doing was I wrote down, I asked myself, what are the things that you're afraid to talk about or to write about? So I made a list of those things. And then I started writing, so yeah, it was scary for me, but it was actually part of the mission I had set for myself was to face that fear. And so I plunge into it. But it was scary. It was scary to write in the first person. It was scary to think about the complexity of my marriage. It was scary to think about how race interferes with my marriage, which seems like it shouldn't be the case. Like these larger social things, political things, surely they have nothing to do with my very private, intimate relationships, but they do, and I think coming to terms with some of these issues have been really, it's not like I resolved them, but coming to terms with the fact that they exist, trying to be clear about how they exert pressure on me and my life and my relationship have been really clarifying. And they have done, it's a huge amount of sort of psychical release for me just to be able to say, yeah, even though we are such individual to each other, my husband and I, really our relationship have been impacted by the fact that he's a white person and I'm not.
Well, great, because I want to ask you about that, actually, because, as Sarah mentioned, she's the daughter of a Japanese immigrant mother, right? And I am the daughter of a Japanese immigrant father, and I'm married to a Black man. So there has been sort of zero times in my family structure, save for, grandfathers and uncles on my mother's side, where I have really directly experienced sort of white male identity in my life. And for you, when you're writing about this, and for Sarah, it's very different. So I wanted to ask you about that because I thought this part of your book was so profound in many ways. And this quote in particular, when you said, looking back, I see that one problem over time was that my husband remained unshaken in his faith and self-reliance while I was hitting the walls of mine. And I wrote that down immediately because I was like, this is really, really important, I think, because when you're writing about this, you write about the struggle of your own identity and how you are perceived by the world, right? Versus that of your white male husband. And so as you're sort of deconstructing and then growing and analyzing this identity, can you talk a little bit more about what insights you had into this? And in particular, I think about this sort of layered on the landscape of our world now, right? And heading into 2025. And you mentioned before sort of this gag order that you had maybe subconsciously or even sometimes consciously placed on yourself, which is something I can relate to as well in terms of topics that may be off limits. So what are the conversations we should be thinking about having around this as well?
When you fall in love and you love someone, they seem so individual and specific to you that it used to seem to me almost like a betrayal for me to say, hey, there is a racial issue between us, And I think for a very long time, my husband and I, did not talk about race between us, even though it happened all around us. For example, the night before our wedding, my father-in-law asked my husband, do you know what you're doing? Meaning marrying a person of color. Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what you're letting yourself in for? And I'm sure he meant it as a genuine concern, but I was horrified that he asked that question. Or and I wrote about this in the book, but, when we had our first daughter, my husband was out with our infant daughter in some store, in the grocery or something. And this woman, a white woman, came up to him and said to him, oh, I got my daughter from China. Where did you get yours? And there are these moments when the external world sort of reminds us that we are racially different. Or even the fact that oftentimes people won't expect we're a couple. Like when we're in line, people won't know that, we're together. Things like that. They seem like very small things, but actually they are all, what I realize is that they're happening all around us, these sort of kind of sounding, and they affect our relationship, even in spite of whatever private whatever intimacies we have. And I think for a long time, I didn't talk about things like that with my husband. Now we do, but for a long time we didn't. So I think part of the difficulty of being an interracial couple is one, it's okay to admit that politics play into intimacy. It's not a betrayal of your relationship to acknowledge that your life has been impacted and shaped by politics, even if that politics is completely inadequate to describing your actual relationship, right? It's both the thing that's inadequate, but also influential. And the second thing is that if you think about it, of course, race impacts your relationship because race isn't just a thing. It is a whole bunch of things. It's how you grow up. It's your family background. It's how you think about social relationships. It's worldviews. I mean, race is this huge, diffusive thing that's part of who you are. And so, of course, that's going to come into play in your relationships. And especially, I think, around children. I think raising interracial children really brings up all these questions about backgrounds and expectations and differences. I think, so as I say, I just want to summarize, like one, it's really important that it's okay to acknowledge that your life has been impacted by large social, cultural, political categories. That doesn't mean you're any less of individuals, right, to each other. And two, that it's super important to talk about it. And I think to talk about it in an honest way, it's hard. It's hard to do that, but I think it's super important.
If I can add to that, and I appreciate you saying that about, I think sometimes, especially for folks who like to say, well, I don't talk about politics, like they try to depersonalize it and remove themselves from it as if it's not part of our living, breathing every single day. Like everything out in our society is shaped by the political forces. And so it's false to say, politics doesn't affect me. That being said, knowing how policies have been shaped. I mean, I think in my marriage, being the, multiracial child myself, both watching my parents, but then more for me, married to a white Canadian guy. I think at the beginning of my marriage, I like you, was just like, oh, it's, he lived in Asia for 7 years. Like he knows how to use chopsticks and appreciates Asian food. Like we're good. It's okay. And to some degree, for sure, because if he didn't have an appreciation for the things that I take for granted, that would have been a whole nother level of difficulty. But I will say, I don't know if he's ever going to listen to this episode, but I will say, I feel like I had to train him and teach him. Like, I think the same way that sometimes women, if they are tired of being oppressed as women, need to talk about things that are important to their identity as women, whether it's, reproductive care or not making enough money compared to other men. I also had to discuss racial, like he knows the racial history of the United States, even though he's Canadian, and yet hadn't lived and breathed the level of discrimination and the institutionalism that is baked into our society. And so I felt like I had to consistently teach him in order for me to be seen. And I remember one time we went to, we both did the Myers-Briggs personality test, but we went to someone to deconstruct our results for us. And in it, we both, for the first level, for those who haven't taken it, they sort of test you on how, where you land on a scale of introversion to extroversion. Are you introverted? Are you extroverted? And he was very much an introvert, and I landed right in the middle of that scale. And the therapist, who was very structurally sound, had to be like, wait, you're just both going to say that Sarah is more naturally extroverted than her husband, and so she has to take charge of all of the social things and do all the things. And yet, if you stop to think about the social pressures, when I see women who are right on this midpoint and are ambiverts, in reality, most of these women are actually very introverted. But what happens in our society when we see women who are introverted, who are not interested in smiling, not interested in small talk, not interested in playing the game? They're called horrible names, right? Like, you're cold, you're frigid, you're, worse names that you can imagine. And so and then if you're married to an introvert, someone's got to coordinate social life. So it's usually the woman who has this social pressure to behave in a way that's not innate to who they are. And so, for example, having my husband hear that from a third party and understand that I have to play a certain role that is not natural to myself, but is necessary for our family to exist and have a social life and to get us all to get along was like the beginning of all of these conversations, including, to the point where he saw January 6th happen and he saw the reaction of the cops and was finally able to be like, wow, could you imagine if the people storming the Capitol looked different? We see this every day and there's a totally different response. And he, like, over the years that we have lived in the US, has understood through all of the conversations we've had that his position as a white heterosexual, not really Christian, but like that, male at the top of the thing is not how the rest of the world lives. His privilege does not extend to the rest of us. And that has been a long process that I have had to do in moments throughout the course of our marriage. And I don't know who takes on that role. Are there people in marriages to white men who don't do that because they might also be white, who don't feel like the need to have these broader conversations? I feel like that's all of our responsibility to bring politics into our houses, because it does affect how we are.
Or right, when they, even the first wave is pointing out that personal is political. And I think one of the many reasons behind writing this book for me was that I wanted to really show or embody the truth of that, right? The ways in which politics gets lived out in the minute grains of our daily lives, and really see what that means when we say the personal is political. And I completely empathize with you. This is back to Ms. Sasha's quoting that line from me, is that, my husband, who is, liberal, very, committed to issues of social justice, nonetheless, even in spite of all that, I feel like because he is a big, tall, white dude, that he doesn't understand that resilience and will and agency can sometimes not be enough, right? Because in his world, being resilient and working hard and having the intention, having that agency would always pay off. And he doesn't really deeply understand, because he never experienced it. He doesn't understand powerlessness. It's something that he has never really experienced, right? And so I think in his point of view for a long time, he was very much like, if someone is suffering from an issue, they can work at it and get themselves out of the situation. And I think sometimes that's true, but sometimes that's not true. Right? Sometimes your best intention, your most private individual willpower is just not enough in the face of a certain kind of systemic discrimination. And that's something that's very hard for him to understand. And that's something that, just like you, over the years, I felt like I have had to not so much teach him, but always sort of like point out to him. And I think and especially in the last few years, seeing some of the really egregious things happening in our country, I think he is starting to understand that a lot more than he did when we were first married, 20 years ago, right? Or 22 years ago. So, yeah, I think all married couples teach other things, hopefully over time, which is, good. And also, the other thing is I was thinking about how different we are as social people. In our cases, he's the extroverted one and I'm the introverted one. But in spite of, even without that kind of personality trait, he walks into any room and he's completely at home. Like, I have never seen him ill at ease. I walk into every room and I am, especially, obvious strange situations. I'm immediately scanning the room for who's in it, what kind of people. I have a kind of like vigilance that he simply doesn't have because he's never been unwelcomed.
That is such a powerful point. And to quickly summarize what you were saying, that idea of those in power may not understand that many other people do not live with that same level of comfort and power all the time. And it's interesting to me that in all of these cases, it's those who are in less positions of power who are constantly having to chip away and point out these things to the people in power. And that's why I'm wondering, Ms. Sasha, in your case, if you can add a little color, no pun intended, to a conversation as a not Black woman, but a woman married to a Black man, right? Like, what are some of the things you've learned?
We don't have that kind of time on here, but I will say, especially around, and to your point, around raising children, right? I have two boys who are Black, Japanese, and white. And I don't know what it's like. I know what it's like to be multi-ethnic, and I know what it's like to grow up sort of bridging cultures and expectations and all of that. But I don't know what it's like to be a Black man in the US. And so I think it is a constant education for me from my husband, from, situations, and I will say that as the mother, right, of Black sons, I am constantly vigilant, right? Because like you, I have experienced people not knowing that these are my children, that people look at us and try to figure out, like, do this math game in their heads of like, well, are they together? Like, we see these boys, and then when my dad's in the picture, everyone just gives up. Like, I don't know, random group of people, I guess. But I think that there is a level of education that is never ending and a level of vigilance that is never ending. And these conversations are sort of, if not openly present in our household, the undercurrents of them are always there.
Do you talk to your sons about these issues? Do you talk to your sons about race and race in America today?
Yes, because I want them to come home. And I think even though, and I'm sure you write about being in Burlingame in the book, I'm sort of slightly down the peninsula from you, but where you were. But we have had instances where people have questioned my husband and sons being in our area. And even in a place that it's considered to be highly progressive, it is not in a lot of ways that we're more hidden and are now much more open. And so I've really taught them and as my husband to be proud of who they are, to know who they are, but to come home. And so that has been, especially as now they're getting towards the teenage years, where they are, moved from cute to threatening, all in sort of a blink of an eye.
Well, I mean, I think raising there's a piece in the book called Mothering a Son, because I think raising a son is itself already a certain kind of challenge, because I don't know what it's like to be a young man, and I don't know how to guide him through that, as my husband, for example. But if you add on the race stuff on top of that, the gender stuff, it's very fraught. And I think, with the recent election and what's happening in our country, all of us who have children who are biracial or look like racialized subjects, I mean, you just worry about them so much, of course.
I'd love to sort of round out this arc on the importance of using our voice, whether it's in our homes or in other settings, because there's a moment you talk about in the book. I think it's when the university or some group in the university was discussing like this difference in diversity requirement, right? And you said in the book that there were a number of white folks who spoke against the need for it, and how people of color in the room were stuck in a no-win situation. Right? Like, can you talk a little bit more about that? Right. And the point of the no-win situation is that if you're a person of color, you do have to speak up for yourself. But the moment you speak as a person of color defending against the pushback, you've already lost the game, because it's not structural. So can you talk a little bit more about this situation and like how white folks and how they can use their privilege to stand up for all of us?
It's very vexing. I think questions of racism and then question of how to address racism in institutions, it's vexing because on the one hand, of course, it's good that they're doing it. On the other hand, it's often done in this sort of very flat-footed way, of optics, right? Of sort of like solving the problem optically, rather than substantially. And then finally, there's also to me, a very vexing problem of sort of like the politics around the politics of race. And so you're referring to a meeting, a university-wide meeting in my home institution where there was a discussion among faculty from all across university about whether or not there should be a graduation requirement for some kind of, multicultural studies or diversity course. And for the first half an hour, only the white people in the room were speaking. And I think it's partially because the people of color in the room felt a little bit like if we were to speak up for it, it just sounds like self-interest, And there were a lot of people who were opposed to it. A lot of the speakers were my white colleagues opposed to it, including the political scientists who got up and said, scholarship should not be political. This is from political scientists. And that we should not be thinking about requiring questions of multiculturalism or diversity, because after all, that's a political issue. That's not this is back to something that Sarah said. It's back to that sort of separation of politics from scholarship, right? And then finally, a few people, white colleagues, spoke up for the requirement, and there was like a visible sense of relief in the room among the colleagues of color, because we're like, oh, good, thank God, someone's speaking up for it. And then eventually, because of that, some of us could say some things. But even as we were saying things, it did seem to me, on the one hand, I'm grateful for the white colleagues who spoke up for this proposal, very grateful for them. At the same time, I also felt the difficulty of why is it that the fact that they spoke up for it means more than someone like me speaking up for it. And that's because the minute the person is not being about a person of color losing the game, the minute you speak as a person of color, you're kind of dismissed as a kind of biased view, right? Whereas the white person's view is not biased because it's universal, because the white view is the default universal view. So, I felt both grateful to those colleagues who spoke up, but also felt the problem of my feeling gratitude, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
I think that duality is really, you put it into words so eloquently there. And I think that that's something that really resonates. Well, it resonates with me, and I'm sure it resonates with a lot of others who've been in similar situations. And I want to stay with the classroom and that sort of your work in the classroom for a moment, because there was another quote in your book that really jumped out at me and especially resonated deeply given where we are collectively now, right? And it's this: I spent decades teaching my students what now seems lofty ideas about ethical responsibility, the limits of identity politics, the easy, fragile morality touted by the righteous on both sides of the political aisle, and democracy's profound complicity with colonialism and other racist institutions. But these days, I feel like I need to step way back in the classroom and talk about the basics: civility, empathy, common good. And yes, to all of that, I think that for all the schools now that are thinking about how do we talk about things like civil discourse? How do we talk about things like just being able to talk to each other, let alone the ideals that we hold? How do we just talk to each other? So can you talk more about this, like how you felt when you wrote it and how you would do this?
I think that as a teacher, what I have discovered is that the level of sophistication of the things that I want to teach is completely correlated to the level of sophistication or not of the political world as it's happening. So, for example, when I was teaching at the UC system in UC Berkeley over 17 years ago, because Berkeley was in the 80s and 90s, a place of identity politics. It's the home of ethnic studies, as many people will point out. Because it was identity politics was very well established there, I was able to teach a lot that were oftentimes me interrogating identity politics. I felt over time, so in the beginning, identity politics was super important, right? Because you establish identities that people have marginalized or dismissed before. But as time goes on, identity politics tended to sort of ossify into this kind of rarefied categories that become even more essentializing and kind of produce a certain kind of segregation of their own. For example, ethnic study would have nothing to do with other departments and things like that. And so I felt like I could actually do the very important work of questioning what are the limits of identity politics. But that kind of sort of sophisticated, like rethinking of identity politics is a privilege that I feel like we have now lost, because we're now back to, because our politics and our civil world has regressed so much, whether it's women's issues or even race issues, we have regressed so much that I can no longer do that sophisticated questioning around identity politics. I have to go back to like understanding what are identities? What does it do? What is a common good? What is civility? What is it to be able to think about different groups of people and talk to them? And so I feel like because our politics have regressed, my teaching has to also like fall back, and so, yeah, I mean, so now I kind of feel like I have to talk to my students about, what is civility? What is common goods? What does it mean to be a democratic citizen? Well, you must think, I mean, the challenge of democracy, right, is that it's not about identifying with someone just like yourself. That's so easy to do that you don't even have to be trained to do it, right? But democracy is about actually like identifying or even just being sympathetic to people who are not like yourself, right? Who are actually like, who may not share. So what does it mean to be in conversation with people who don't share your interests, who may not be like you, who may not share your religion, who may not share your beliefs? And so I feel like these days I have to really like pull back on what I'm teaching because the politics have regressed so much, regressed and deteriorated so much in our world. It's pretty sad.
Oh, it is. I'm just curious, and I don't know if off the top of your head, how do you describe civility?
It's funny because I'm actually now teaching a class called Nice People.
I love that. Can I audit it?
Yes, it's actually, I have great students. I'm having so much fun. And it's really a class about how niceness has been weaponized as a kind of alibi for sometimes for extreme narcissism, like nice white people. And actually, the class is not just about nice white people, it's also about nice Asian people, how niceness plays in the Asian American community, how niceness and respectability plays in the African American community, and then of course, like how niceness plays in white communities too. So it's not so nobody gets off easy in this class. But so I think the classes really want to really understand what is civility, what are the different kinds of civility at work, what are some of the agendas behind civility? And there are good agendas and there are bad agendas. And, the class tried to unpack all that. But I think the word that is missing today is, or two words. One is common good, and the two is actually kind of a civility in the sense of civil, of understanding yourself as a citizen in a social world. And I think that is really, in our rapidly sort of polarized, antagonistic world, we have forgotten how to be a citizen with other people. We have forgotten also even the idea of a common good. I think so much now is about the world is about it's kind of selfish. I'm out for my own, that we forgot that, a democratic structure has to be a fundamental common, you have to have a commitment to common good. And I know that's hard. That's hard, which is why democracy is like an experiment, right? And it's something that we have to keep investing in. And I feel like we stop doing that investment, as a country. And that's why it's so devastating to see what's been going on in the last, what, 4 to 7 years.
Yeah. Oh, you're our people. We get it. So I guess the way that you just described the need for us to think more deeply about concepts that I think in the past were taken for granted, but now need to be reestablished as norms. I'm wondering if we can talk about a few more deep thoughts, because I don't know where to start with the concept of breaking down the model minority myth, the SFAA plaintiffs and Edward Bloom, the desire to be part of the country. As someone who is sort of on the fringes, but has you always as the perpetual foreigner, right? The question of like, where are you from when some people have been born in this country, and we started this whole conversation with this idea of American success and this American dream and these models that were put onto us. So what do you want to say to white people about these sorts of structures and to other Asian Americans also who may never have thought this deeply about some of the concepts that we were just talking about?
Well, I think one thing I want to say is that, and this might seem very simple, but just one, say that Asian Americanness is a mode of racialization, just like African Americanness is a mode of racialization. And the fact that Asian Americans occupy this very complicated place in American racial politics. On the one hand, they're often thought of as white adjacent and or not racialized because of the whole model minority myth, right? They're all doctors and lawyers. And so what do you have to complain about? That kind of mindset. But at the same time, I think Asian Americans are deeply racialized, not only racialized, but also nationalized in a certain way. I was thinking about, in 2020 during the pandemic and all that anti-Asian violence, it wasn't only coming from white people, it was coming from other people of color too, which just sort of reminds you that what Asian Americans suffer from is not just racism, but also xenophobia. So they get this sort of double whammy of alienation going on. But it is an alienation that is often, I think, unacknowledged, right? Because Asian Americans are seen as unproblematic because they're, gosh, they are, as I said, they're all, doctors or lawyers, which is, of course, deeply untrue. I mean, Asian Americans as a group not only is incredibly diverse ethnically and nationally, but it has the highest income disparity of any racial ethnic group in the US. But things like that are little known because the stereotype is of a certain kind of Asian upper or middle class Asian American. So I think the first thing I want to say is that Asian Americans they're a racialized category, they're a racialized group of people, and that have been nationalized also in certain ways, and that race in America is never simply black and white. I know it looks that way a lot, but it's never been black and white. There's always been a kind of triangulation. And by always, I mean legally, and we don't have time to go into this at all, but like oftentimes in US legal history, whenever a race is being ratified, it's often done through a kind of triangulation. So, for example, during Brown v. Board of Education, Japanese internment was raised as a alibi for segregation. And so, legally speaking, there's oftentimes, the play of black and white often gets sort of mediated through a third category, which is not exclusively, but often Asians and Asian Americans. So understanding that race operates in America in always very entangled way. And I always say that I think what's more important than identity politics is understanding identity entanglements. I think identity politics often disguises the kind of racial entanglement that goes on in US racial landscape. Does that make sense? I don't know if...
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm obviously always here for the hours of legal argument that we could go into. But as the family of someone who is a lawyer, whose brother is a doctor, so definitely living that American myth. I hope my parents listen to this episode. Anyway, I really appreciate that because I think that I like the phrase identity entanglement because it calls out the complicated nature of the relationships of how racism and identity sort of have this interplay in our court system and how there are often third or even fourth parties, right, that serve to complicate any sort of legal decision because it's always in proximity or in relation to something else that has happened. And so I appreciate you pulling that thread for us. So in the interest of not having 4 hours of legal discussion to follow, and in the interest of time generally, what else haven't we asked you that you'd like to share with our audience?
So the book has a lot of different topics, everything from American Girl dolls to Joan Didion packing tips to, sushi, Atlanta sushi restaurants. But I guess the one thing we haven't talked about that I think is a big part of the book is this question of what it means to be an immigrant, and I think that the immigrant narrative is oftentimes sort of like touted in American culture and, a lot of people talk about it. But actually, I think immigration is such a complex, even under the category of immigrants, there's a huge category of differences. Those people who immigrated when they're 10 versus people who immigrated when they're 25 versus people who immigrated when they're 40. It actually, the immigrant is this incredibly vast category. But I think for one of the things I feel like one of the things the book is also a record of my own trying to remember things that I have forgotten. I mean, there's a ways in which, on the one hand, I have never stopped feeling like a Chinese immigrant. Even after having lived in the United States for 50 years, far longer than I've lived in Taiwan, even in spite of that, I have always thought of myself as an immigrant. And yet, at the same time, I've forgotten so much of my past. I mean, I don't even think in Chinese anymore. And I realized that when I thought I was dying, that so much of that past, which I had forgotten, they sort of came back to me a lot right after I was recovering from chemo, and I was sort of like coming back into being who I was. All these memories that I didn't even knew I'd forgotten came back. And I really wanted to write it down for me and for my kids because they will be gone with me, once I pass. So I think the book, well, we didn't talk about today, but I think it's also a big part of the book, is this question of memory, remembering the past, and how that past, even when it's kind of half forgotten, remains a very sort of important storage in me, and how my ties to that vague past is nonetheless a huge part of who I still am today.
I appreciate that so much. We were just talking in our home actually about family had come to visit, and my mother, the Japanese immigrant, regularly thanks the ancestors for her being able to be where she is today. And for my children who are raised in a culture where it's very insular, it's very me, I did all this myself, and to have to remind them, we intentionally remind them, you're here because we have given you the opportunities that you happen to be also lucky to be born where you are in history and in this country. But you'd only be here because of all the people who come, that we're all part of this incredible legacy that goes into our past is true for every single one of us. And I think the immigrant story it holds even closer to my mom because she intentionally removed herself from one place and moved to another. So those ties are very conscious. It's so easy to slip them into the past and just think that we're not part of this, but we all are. So I appreciate you sharing that and your stories in the book.
I'm so thrilled that 2 years ago, my daughter, who was at the time 18, decided that she was going to go to Taiwan by herself. She who speaks no word of Chinese. She went by herself. She found, my grandpa's old house. And I mean, she basically Googled her map and Google Translate her way through Taiwan. And I just admired that so much. I don't think I had her kind of courage at 18. So, but I was so moved that she went to look for basically my roots, not even her roots exactly, but, mediated hers. But anyway, so.
I love that. Where can people find your book and where can they find you?
It's on Pantheon book and Amazon, .com. Everywhere. It should be pretty easy to find, certainly online, but also in bookstores. So thank you so much. So I've talked to you too for a long time. This is so much fun. And actually, before we go, can I ask you about the title of the podcast?
Misasha, you want to take this one?
Well, so Sarah and I, being multi-ethnic, have spent a lot of time in circles full of white women because sometimes, we are not immediately perceived as multi-ethnic. And I think by virtue of spending all this time in these circles of white women, we know three things about those circles. The first is what is talked about. The second is what's not talked about. And the third is what's talked about when white women believe that there are no people of color in the space. And that third part in particular was what combined with the fact that Sarah and I, have children and want a better world for our children than, especially the current trajectory that we're on, thought well, what if we could take that knowledge of white women and change the conversations in these circles, right? And expand them out of the topics that we know are comfortable and really make them inclusive of everyone. And if we could do that, like, then we could really change that trajectory. So, we decided, like, how can we do this? Like, we'll start a podcast, knowing zero about podcasting. So, we got some mics, we found some great editors, and we started, in April of 2019. And so have been, talking to white women, and not just white women, but, everyone out there, but specifically, what can we do to change those conversations, right? And what should white women really be thinking about if we're really invested in that future?
May I first was an example of the number 3 of what they talk about when they think when they think it's only white women?
Well, I can give one example. I have been in many book clubs over the years, and it was after George Floyd's murder, probably a year or 2 years after that. And we were reading a book by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and we were all out at a restaurant sitting in one of those circular booths. And we said, like, so who's read the book? Let's get started on the conversation. Almost nobody had. And someone pushed the book into the center and said, but aren't we done talking about race? And I was like, okay, so that very insightful conversation, right? Like, the white women in the group thought we were done. Like, the era of talking about racism was over. There was no need for it. And we know very clearly that there is absolutely still a need for all of these conversations to continue, because things have not changed, and in fact are going in the other direction at the moment. So those sorts of things continue to crop up.
A picture is with me of someone that I am friendly with who goes to my gym, a woman that I have, I don't know her well because we only see each other at the gym, but we see each other at the gym a lot. So this is someone I've known in a certain way for a long time. And she said to me, I'm just so tired of people talking about race. I mean, aren't we done with that? And I said, actually, no. But that has actually been said to me in my face. So yeah. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
You two have been so wonderful. I feel like I can talk to you for hours, but thank you so much for this chance. I appreciate
Yes,
it.
absolutely. Thank you. Love what you're hearing? Follow us at the Dear White Women podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Podcasts to get our fresh new insights on how you can help dismantle systemic racism, one conversation at a time, every Wednesday. Do you love learning via visuals? Follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Dear White Women Podcast, and at Twitter at DWW Podcast. And do you want us to keep making good work? Support our Patreon and keep an eye out for opportunities to use our webinars, DEI consulting work, and more if you want us to help bring change into your own spaces.